Katwiwa.
How's everyone doing? Hey, okay, cool. I've been having trouble deciding what pieces I wanted to perform for you all because a half hour to any African person is a really short amount of time to try and communicate stories. Also, a lot of the stories that I have, I'm not sure if a lot of you have the context for them, especially given some of the questions around race and race relations in the US and across the world that I've heard. So I'll do my best to give you both stories and the context for the stories. But then I was having this conversation yesterday with someone about how in the US, everyone's always so sad and depressed in their poems. And I was like, oh shit, that's me. So I wanted to start off by offering you all, once a year I try and write a funny poem. Just so I can prove to myself I can. And yeah, I'll read you all this attempt. It came from, I actually don't identify as a woman, gender non-conforming person and gender fluid. And I know it throws people off because they're like, you're the Women of the World Poetry Slam champ. And I'm like, yeah, sit on that. And so one of the things that, especially when I travel a lot, I tend to dress a lot more masculine, and I'm received as masculine sometimes just as a male. And people's reactions to my masculinity are so interesting because it feels like an affront to their masculinity. Even if I'm just existing, sitting, sipping my tea over there, I get a lot of sometimes violent reactions just to my being. So I wrote this piece imagining if we could actually have a frank conversation about masculinity and how funny it actually is when you really look at what it stands on and how fragile it is. So, I need your help. When I say, your masculinity is so fragile, I want you to say, how fragile is it? Cool? All right. Also, I'm not guaranteeing it's funny. It's an attempt at humor, okay? So, your masculinity is so fragile, it would starve in a house made of kitchens. It seems to only know how to make meals of women's bodies. It thinks Mr. Clean is a real live person. It is still telling people that the air is suddenly dusty every time you watch Set It Off, instead of just admitting that that shit is sad and it made you cry. Your masculinity is so fragile, it thinks getting a compliment from a man makes him or you gay. So fragile, it thinks you need to be a dick in order to be a man. So fragile that when a woman tells you no, you hear try harder. But when she tells you she is a man, you learn to recognize restraint. Your masculinity is so fragile. It thinks gift wrapping catcalls with compliments means women should receive them as gifts. So fragile, it becomes a Grinch or a gun if they don't. So fragile that it would shatter under the weight of the truth, that it's not helping anyone, especially yourself. Your masculinity is so fragile that when it shatters, it'll probably still expect a woman to clean it up off the floor. So fragile. That was a trick you weren't supposed to repeat, but it's fine. So fragile that we must eventually deal with the fact that this world, it makes men hard because it is far less complicated than allowing them to just be human. So fragile that when it shatters, and if you're lucky, it will eventually shatter. It will die a heavy thing, having consumed so much of your being and so many messages about what it should be. But on that day, I look forward to finally meeting you. So that's probably the last time you're gonna smile for the next 25 minutes, so enjoy it. Hold on to that feeling. A lot of the conversations folks have been wanting to ask about, it's I feel like I've been playing Ask a Black Person the whole time that I've been here. It's true, I don't know if any of y'all noticed, I'm the only Black person here until my friend came who also is Black. So people have been coming and asking those questions, and it's really, really hard to explain whiteness without a historical lens, a social current lens, and also just an understanding that it's not actually based within the United States at this point. It is a global phenomenon. So in a way, all of you actually do have an understanding of whiteness and how it operates. And I know that because I've felt similarly in these spaces as I do in the United States. This poem that I'm about to do for you all came after a long period where I'd actually stopped writing. I'd entered into university, which is a predominantly white space in the US, and one of the main facets of whiteness that most affects people of color is that it silences us. It makes us feel as if our stories are not legitimate because we're actually told constantly that they are not legitimate in the eyes of whiteness. And so I just was in school for a while, my voice wasn't being heard in a lot of different ways, and I stopped writing. And then Trayvon Martin was murdered. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old black boy who lived in Florida, was visiting one of his parents, and he went to the store and he got some iced tea and some Skittles and was walking back talking to one of his friends wearing a black hoodie, and a white passing Latino man called the police and said, "There's someone suspicious in my neighborhood." Now, what he called suspicious was that he was walking really slowly and he was wearing a black hoodie, but really what we know that he saw suspicious was the black skin that he was wearing. And the police actually told him, "Do not follow this boy, we'll handle it, whatever." He said, "No, I'm going to do that." And so he went, and he eventually murdered Trayvon Martin. And nobody cared. The police did not arrest him. His family had to go on for months just asking for people to even recognize the injustice that had happened. And then eventually, George Zimmerman was actually not held responsible for the murder of Trayvon Martin. Earlier today, Bob was talking about how in different parts of the world there are certain tensions that you can feel when you're in the place. And said that the US wasn't one of those places, and I don't believe that. Since 2012, maybe it's for those of us in particular bodies, I come to you in a body that is black, that is immigrant, and is queer. There is such a tension that our lives really feel like they're at stake, and we have actually lost people in our struggle and in our battle. So I dedicate this piece and this whole set, honestly, to black folks in the US who are fighting, and we are surviving, y'all. Like, it is a testament to our resilience and our being that we are still here. Of the 7 deadly American sins, being black has become numbers 1 through 6. If this statement strikes you as radical, you haven't been paying attention. I bet you were surprised when the Martin verdict came in and guilt wasn't mentioned. And let's be clear, this was the Trayvon Martin case. George Zimmerman was never on trial. He murdered a child while we were more concerned with whether or not a boy had smoke in his lungs than the fact that he would never again use them. All over the nation, people claimed this wasn't an issue of race, that the outcome was legally on par, accusing the left-leaning liberal blackjack dealers of once again playing the race card. They asked, what would have happened if Zimmerman were black? Would things have been any different? Well, of course they'd be different. If Zimmerman were black, this would have ended with a prison sentence. You can ask Marissa Alexander, a black mother, about any specifics that I'm missing, because for shooting a ceiling, she was sentenced to more time in prison than Trayvon Martin spent on the face of this planet. We live in a world where a man can be set free after admitting to the slaying of an unarmed teen. And CBS News has the audacity to run a piece headlined by Zimmerman's brother stating that George would now spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder because, and I quote, there are people who would want to take the law into their own hands. It's funny how some things are so black and white, while others just taste like the rainbow. Red like the blood that stained the sidewalk where he fell after being profiled for walking too slowly. Yellow for the son of Tracy and Sabrina that shone bright by day, but by night has stopped glowing. Green for the grass stains on pants that hung so low they heightened sensitivities without knowing. Brown for the identity Zimmerman played up for the all-white. Sorry, there was one Latino sweater we now consider a diverse jury. White for the privilege Zimmerman wore as he was out doing his neighborhood patrolling. And black is just another name for numbers 1 through 6 of America's 7 deadly sins. And the seventh was ever believing that we would find justice in the hands of a system that pioneered the oppression of Native Americans, the enslavement of African people, carried out forced deportations even though we all know who's really illegal. They gave summer camps to the Japanese. Who needs internships when you have internment? Who needs lower unemployment when we have prisons that turn profit? See, we don't need to fear God when we have capitalism to worship. And we certainly don't need these assholes always getting away in our neighborhoods. So watch it. Watch it. I was watching a trial that was over long before it could begin. So when the verdict finally came in, all I could hear were the words of the late Dr. King, calling for us to not allow the deafening noise of injustice to drown out the sounds of freedom's ring. So today, in honor of his legacy, I ask you this one thing. Please join me in this final call to let freedom ring. Let freedom ring for the rushing rivers of melanin that have overflown into our streams of consciousness so that people now claim we live in a post-racial society. Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring for the meeting tables of self-appointed gun-toting concrete cowboys found in the ranks of your neighborhood watch, or is it your neighborhood NRA? Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from the graves of Emmett Till, Fred Hampton, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Russell Davis, and all the other brothers whose names we'll never know, because even in 2018, a black person being killed still isn't enough to make it onto the evening news. Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring. I said let freedom ring. Free at last. Free at last. Dear God Almighty, this is not the freedom for which we've asked. So sometimes whiteness, especially when it's institutionalized, serves to silence in very covert ways. But there are also very specific and overt ways that we are also silenced. This next piece that I'll do for y'all is illustrative of that. I was asked to give a TED Talk last year. And I was like, great, awesome, I have ideas that I think matter. So I put together one about how reproductive justice and Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black lives, are essentially the same thing, about valuing the worth and inherent dignity of Black life and protecting it in the womb and outside of the womb. And I did my rehearsal, it went great, I thought. But then the TED curator came up to me and explicitly asked me to remove Black Lives Matter completely from my TED Talk, right? Wasn't a guy. We have this thing where we also assume that white women are not like bearers of whiteness. They absolutely are. So complicit in the project of whiteness. So this white woman is the one who said that to me. But I did say, fuck that woman. And I ended up putting that story in my TED Talk, which is a whole nother list of things. A lot of shit happened. It was nah. Anyway, but I want to share this piece too to expand the conversation, because I feel like there's this way that we also talk about Black death in the US as if it only happens to Black men, which is actually not true. Black folks across the spectrum are disproportionately killed. That includes Black queer folks, Black women, Black children across the spectrum. If you look at the statistics, we are under attack. As well as Indigenous folks in the US, they actually have higher rates of police death and different things than Black folks, so. I've always wanted to be a mother. Growing up, I heard all about the joys of motherhood. I used to dream of watching my womb weave wonder into this world. See, I knew I was young, but I figured it couldn't hurt to start planning for something so big so early. But now, I'm 27 years old, and I don't know if I have what it takes to stomach motherhood in America. See, over the years, America has taught me more about parenting than any book on the subject. It's taught me how some women give birth to babies and others to suspects. It has taught me that this body will birth kin who are more likely to be held in prison cells than to hold college degrees. There is something about being Black in America that has made motherhood seem complicated. Seem like I don't know what to do to raise my kids right and keep them alive. Do I tell my son not to steal because it is wrong or because they will use it to justify his death? Do I tell him that even if he pays for his Skittles and sweet tea, there will still be those in the neighborhood that will watch him and see a criminal before child, who will call the police and not wait for them to come? Do I even want the police to come? Too many Sean Bells go off in my head when I consider calling 911. I will not take it for Oscar granted that they will not come and kill my son. You see, we may have gotten rid of the nooses, but I still consider it lynching when they murder Black boys and leave their bodies for 4 hours in the sun, as a historical reminder that there is something about being Black in America that's made motherhood seem like mourning. Sound like one morning I could wake up and see my son as a repeat of last week's story. Sound like I could wake up and realize the death of my daughter wouldn't even be newsworthy. You can't tell me that Sandra Bland was the only Black woman whose violence deserved more than our silence. What about our other dark-skinned daughters in distress whose deaths we have yet to remember? What about our children whose lives don't fit neatly between the lines of your genders? Apparently, nothing is a protector if you come out of a body that looks like this. There is something about being Black in America that has made motherhood sound like something I'm not sure I look forward to. I've written too many poems about dead Black children to be naive, about the fact that there could one day be a poem written about my kids. But I do not want to be a mother who gave birth to poems. I do not want a stanza for a son, nor a line for a little girl, nor a footnote for a child who doesn't fit into this world. No, I do not want children who will live forever in the pages of poetry, yet can't seem to outlive me. I was planning to keep track of time. There's this thing where I'm African, it just doesn't work. So I have no idea when I started, but I don't even know where the organizers are. But when you need me to get off the stage, just like give me a yell or something, and I'll probably do another poem and then get off the stage. Okay. So I'll take you guys back to the birth of my Blackness, which is actually not in the United States. It was in Kenya. And in many ways, the birth of whiteness was also not in the United States. It was actually around the 1600s. White race has a very particular, interesting history. This shit is just made up, like straight up made up to justify so many things that ended up happening. It's hard because now it's still made up, but its legacy is very real and it's very felt. So there's this way that we can't actually just dismiss it because it's made up, because it's actually impacting us in very, very real ways. Colonization is something that I've thought a lot about in the last couple of years. I didn't get a chance to go home a lot after we'd come to the United States because it's expensive. And since I went to study abroad in Kenya when I was in university, and I've just dedicated my own finances now each year to make sure that I go home. And when I do, it's wonderful, it's freeing, I'm in my home, and then I'm also like, I'm in a colonized home. Like, this is not actually the Kenya that my grandparents came up in. My grandparents were freedom fighters in the Mau Mau struggle, and they often don't talk about it because they took blood oaths in order to fight their war, but you can see the disappointment sometimes in their faces, and in the Mau Mau who are active, who say, this Kenya is not the Kenya that we built, it's just neo-colonization, it's just Black faces in white spaces. So, you all know what persona poems are? I can't tell if you're nodding your head, so yes, no, maybe. It's where you use somebody else's voice. It's like personification. So I want to share this piece with you all that a friend of mine, I've never actually taken a writing or a poetry class, so it's always interesting to me to be identified as a poet. I've always been a storyteller my whole life. And this actually came out of the first and only poetry class I've ever taken that was called Demons, Diaspora, and Magic. So they asked us to choose a particular demon that had haunted you your whole life. I chose colonization. And they asked you at one point to speak in the voice of the demon the way it had spoken to you throughout your life. And so that's this piece. It's called Colonization Speaks to the Kenyan. I never asked to be greater than you. And you may never have asked for my greatness, but how are you to know that you needed it anyway? See, I once studied your people. I shuddered at the shape of their small skulls. I discovered them empty as the Rift Valley, and I filled them with myself. I wish I could say it was difficult, but I need you to know, Mwende, that it was at least necessary. See, the thing you should always remember is I did this for your own good, that I sent my own flesh and blood across oceans to save your people from themselves, that I feared their ships would sink under the weight that burdens white men, but I had faith in our divine mission. Did you know when I arrived, your people, they stood proudly behind backwards traditions, that most had never read the Bible, let alone seen it, but did you know that most had also never seen a gun? That all they knew were sticks and stones and spells, but they soon learned one way or another what it meant to bow on their knees before a greater power. You see, I claim this land as my own. I built a solid foundation of a master's home using Kenyan bodies as bricks and broken promises as mortar. And to this day, your people still give me their bodies in disease and war and greed to fortify my home. And I know you like to think yourself and them resistant, convinced you can decolonize your mind when the deaths of tens of thousands of Kenyans could not even decolonize the land. Do I need to remind you of those who resisted? Those who screamed rebellion from the rotting mouths of walking corpses? How their waterfalls of blood failed to water the seeds of a true revolution or flush me from this land? How it barely quenched the greedy thirst of future presidents that I groomed in my backyard to run my country for me when I left, and when I left, your people didn't even notice all I took with me, but what's more, they didn't seem to notice how much of myself I'd left behind. You see, I know you like to pretend going home is all shambas and goat meat. I've noticed that you never mentioned the Kentucky Fried Chicken at the mall, or how English is an official language of Kenya. I've noticed that you hide these things as if you are ashamed of me, but Mwende, I need you to know that if I had never gone to your home, then you might never have left it. That you might have been born in the woods instead of a hospital. Another animal snarling at the sun, your mother's screams howling alongside the wind, but look at you now. Am I not the reason you stand where you are today? Do people not tell you how beautiful I sound coming out of your mouth? Did your parents not thank me when they left their ancestral home, praying to my God for journey mercies when they left in a language I packed tightly beneath their tongues? Did I not give your country my greatness? Do they not now sit at the world's table even though we stole the raw materials to build it? Do your children not now look like me? Do they not bleach their skin and hide their coarse hair? Are traditions not grains of sand lost in a desert of remembrance? My customs, an oasis of assimilation. My language, a gift I gave you so you could thank me. So thank me. Use the tongues I did not cut from your primitive mouths to do so. Raise high the hands I did not sever from wrists in gratitude. For I have given you everything I have not taken away, and forgiven you for forgetting who you were before I came. This next piece that I'll do for y'all was one where when I really started to sit with myself and have an honest conversation about how colonized I actually was. I sat and I looked back at my life, and one of the places that I had the most internal conflict before I even had the language of colonization and personhood was in my religion. I was raised as a Christian, both in Kenya and in the United States. And there was always something funny to me about this portrait of this blonde, blue-eyed man sitting in my grandmother's home who had fought those people to get them off the land. There was this inherent contradiction that we just never really talked about because religion is very sensitive to people. A few days ago, y'all heard about John Chow, the missionary who was shot by arrows on the island because he was gonna go save them, and they sent him to meet Jesus. I wrote a piece. That's not a joke, it's what happened, shit. I wrote a piece for The Independent that talked about my own personal journey as someone who had begun as a very devout Christian to now being very I really don't mess with all that. And it really stemmed from just my explorations around colonization and studying my history, finding out what my own indigenous history and traditions were, and seeing just how I was unable personally to reconcile them. And so this piece that I'll share with y'all I actually wrote in church. It took 2 years to write because I don't go to church that often. I only go when I visit my parents because I'm an African child and you're just obedient until you're 94 and it's a thing, all right. It's called The Gospel of Colonization. When I was a girl, my family emigrated from Kenya to the United States. New country, new people, new language. But the one thing that remained was the presence of my Savior, Jesus Christ. This didn't surprise me. I grew up knowing my God was everywhere, that he saw everything. I believed him to be a benevolent being whose image I was created in, even as I looked up at his portrait that was hanging in my grandmother's home, a frame full of blonde hair, pink and pale skin. Eyes, a light blue piercing enough to draw blood. An image so holy, but one that did not allow me to see myself in my creator. But as a child, it didn't matter. I believed in the word of God. I read it like a love letter that he wrote me. I saw the preacher as the postman speaking deliverance each service until one day in Sunday school, we were wrapping English Bibles for poor kids in Botswana, and I wondered, in what language does God listen? Did he hear my prayers clearly in Swahili? Did he hear me better now that my amens were sent up in a foreign man's tongue? A foreign man whose face looked more like his blue-eyed son I'd seen growing up. I thought maybe we sent English Bibles because his ears, they tasted the sweet sound of prayer better when spoken in this tongue. I know, looking back, it sounds like a silly moment to start questioning your faith, but that day, I learned that once the seed of doubt is planted, its roots will always thirst. So I began to read about God. Each page like a raindrop of history. I lost my religion in floods of understanding, but I grew closer to divinity, and eventually branches on that tree of doubt spread so wide that they blocked out even his divine light. It was around the same time that I realized that the poor kids I'd sent Bibles to, well, they were poor partly because of how that Bible had been used. See, when the missionaries came to Africa, Christianity swept our lands like a biblical plague. Our firstborns were smothered under the cover of night. Our waters, they flowed red and full, swollen like the bodies of stolen daughters. We were left in the darkness of colonization for 8 decades. We became a continent of Jobs, promised salvation but seeing suffering tenfold, from those who came claiming grace but belting gospels of genocide, from those who beat tradition from elder tongues and called it tithe, from those who called losing our culture a tax for finding salvation in Christ. And ain't it funny how they used their God to justify the taking of what ours had blessed us with for centuries? How they claimed to introduce God to our lands when our lands birthed even their humanity. See, Jomo Kenyatta once said, when the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land, and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. And when we opened them, they had the land, and we had the Bibles. It's not done, it's not done. Yes, indeed. They had the Bibles. Do you see how swiftly they pull wool from the Lamb of God over our eyes? The greatest lie colonialism ever told was that it brought God to Africa. Yes, they brought their Bibles, but they did not bring God to our lands. Yes, they brought their churches, but they did not bring God to our lands. Yes, they brought their guns, but they did not bring God to our lands. What they brought was an image made to justify the breaking of our bodies like communion bread, the spilling of our blood like wine, a false idol that to this day I still see hanging in so many Kenyan homes. A frame full of blonde hair, pink and pale skin, eyes, a light blue piercing enough to draw blood, to have already drawn blood. Oh, okay. I'm gonna do this piece because 2 people have asked me about it already. I can't see you, but I think one of them was you over there who just said, It's a piece called Dear White People. And I actually like to share that with people that I didn't write the majority of this piece. What happened is, I'm telling you, the levels that whiteness will impact you sometimes, right? I had this very small incident where I was trying to organize some community tickets, ironically for the film Dear White People, when it was being released. And the white woman who was the community liaison to the black community, doesn't make sense in and of itself, was really condescending and rude and just fucked a whole bunch of stuff up. And I was made to also feel like I couldn't just say that directly to her. And so I sat with myself and I was sort of beating myself up about it. And I was like, no, don't do that. That's not you. That's a project of whiteness, right? And to affirm myself, I went on Facebook and I said, hey, y'all, this thing just happened. Very vague the way people are on Facebook. Where, I felt like I was silenced in this way. Has anyone else ever felt like that? And if so, what would you say? What would you have wanted to say in that moment? An hour later, there was like 150 comments. Each of them were like from a paragraph to like pages long, and I sat with that, and I was like, oh, this was a moment, too, where you gaslit yourself, where you didn't actually believe that whiteness was this silencing, where an hour later you had too many comments. And it wasn't just black folks. A whole bunch of Asian folks had come on. They're like, I know I'm not black, but... And I was like, wow, great. Also didn't ask for that. There's a way, too, that this whole people of color thing is also starting to erase blackness, right? So it's like if I specifically ask for black voices, I'm specifically not asking for your voice, so, you know. This piece, then, I actually ended up printing all of the different comments together, and you all know what an erasure poem is? It's like when you have a block of text or a particular piece of text and you may delete certain lines or words from it in order to recreate the text and get new meaning from it. So this piece is actually directly drawn from those Facebook posts, as well as some little additions that I did just to make it a little bit more rhythmic and poetic. But I hope that this one also offers a little bit more context and understanding in all of the different ways that whiteness intersects with people, because people were answering from a whole bunch of different places, from classrooms, from workplaces, from walking down the street in your own neighborhood. There were all kinds of ways. So, dear white people, I don't even know where to start. In between my busy schedule comprised entirely of surviving white America, there is simply no time to write letters. Besides, any letter I write will most likely bring tears to your eyes, and I, for one, have had my fill of white tears. There are days I think you aren't worth my ink, that your whiteness is draining me of too much energy. Can't give you a taste of the tea for fear you'll colonize the whole kitchen. But today, I am too angry to remain silent. Dear white people, stop making everything about you and how uncomfortable you are. I honestly don't give a flying fuck about your comfort level. You have made my very existence an exercise in discomfort. It is time for you to make room at the table. Better yet, go sit in the living room. I am not here to coddle your feelings, not here for your amusement. No, you cannot touch my hair. This isn't a damn petting zoo. And stop coming into my office asking for the managers if you aren't already looking at one. Dear white people, stop telling me about this colorblind society you allegedly live in. Telling me you don't see race is the racist drivel I hope you choke on. Telling me you respect me but don't see my color is like saying you have to pretend I'm not black in order to respect me. But let me assure you, I am black, though there are plenty of things I'm not, like your sassy black friend. Stop saying, hey, girl, when you see me. You aren't that slick. I hear the way you talk to Becky and Steve every day. You sound like Vacation on Martha's Vineyard where you spent, shit, I gotta look this one up, sorry. Matter of fact. Sorry, I tend to do this poem only when I'm in front of majority white audiences. That just hasn't happened in a while. I'm like, shit, what do I have to say to white people? Oh. All right. Stop saying, hey, girl, when you see me. You ain't that slick. I hear the way you talk to Becky and Steve every day. You sound like Vacation on Martha's Vineyard where you spent summers wading in the bitter blue of the Atlantic. How I wish my toes could touch the ocean without stepping on the bones of my ancestors. Dear white teachers, why don't I know who my ancestors are? Why is only one part of my history important enough to teach? For the love of God, stop swiveling your heads every time slavery is mentioned. Newsflash, I wasn't there. And just because I'm the only black person in this class doesn't mean you can ask me to speak on behalf of my race. I believe you really care about the opinion of black students when you stop shutting down conversations because I call a white student racist. Dear white people, why do you hate being called racist more than you hate racism? Why do you listen to Tim Wise over actual black people about the black experience? Dear white people, stop using black on black crime as a reason we shouldn't be outraged by the murder of black people by white cops. If a black person kills another black person, they will go to jail, and that is what we call justice. If a white cop kills a black person, they will get paid leave, and that is what we call justice. Apparently, justice is when a black body dies. Dear white people, every time we've written white people, we've written it in lowercase because I'm tired of you capitalizing on our pain. We are angry and raw and tired and angry and raw and tired and angry and raw and tired and tired and tired. But we will not rest because we know the future belongs to those who prepare for it. And you have been getting us ready for centuries. Also just wanted to open it up. Is there a poem anyone did want to hear that I haven't said? Just in case. Great. I'm just gonna do like 3 more, is that cool? All right. Oh, these are some interesting ones, okay. So this is one that I wrote a few years ago. Looking at mental health. Jesus Christ. That is, I really appreciated all of the pieces last night that dealt with wellness in all of the different ways that we are unwell. And it was a real struggle for me to come to terms with my own unwellness, especially mental unwellness. As a Black person, there's this thing in the US, there's a huge stigma around getting help. It's like a white person's thing. A lot of that actually has to do with like affordability and white folks actually having access to things, so it becomes a white person thing, but we don't have to talk about all that. And then Africans, we also just have this thing about like being really strong and like surviving through anything and not actually having conversations about things that we all know we're holding and are really held deeply. And then also women folk, there's this way that we're also just made to hold on to our hurt as if it's a rite of passage or something into womanhood or into being. So this piece is actually not finished. I don't know if it'll ever be finished. It's a really difficult piece for me to write, but I still share it with people because people have said that they need to hear it. So it's called To Be Depressed and. In middle school, I started to wake up sad. I didn't know why or when it would happen, but by high school, I stopped wanting to wake up at all. I used to tell myself each morning that things would be better, then beat myself up at night for being a liar when they weren't. I started to count down the days until I died when I realized how slowly it would come, how my hands shook like my voice still sometimes does. I learned then, to be depressed is to slowly suffocate on your own silence. It is speaking yourself back to life, even when your tongue is tied in the shape of a noose. When I was 17, I was raped by a boy who inhaled my desire to be wanted and breathed back the stench of a person's fear. Afterwards, he held me, and we fell asleep outside beneath the night sky. His eyes, they twinkled like the stars, and the tender way he held me convinced me the nighttime must have swallowed my no instead of the darkness inside of him. The next morning, when he left without a word, I realized to be woman and depressed is to each day have silence enter your body without consent. And there it remains throughout the day, uninvited into this house you call bones, trying each day to claim it as home. I moved to New Orleans when I was 18 years old. I was a walking corpse whose life felt like a walking casket, open casket funeral that no one bothered to show up for. I just left a hospital where each day I was reminded that help for this kind of sadness was reserved for those whose skin matched the powder and privilege that got them there in the first place. I remember once, a pair of blue eyes with a sharp tongue asked me if my family could even afford to keep me in a place like this. I'll never forget how her lips curled into a smile when I left because they couldn't. As I walked out, I remembered to be Black and depressed is to literally not be able to afford to stay alive and that be exactly the way they want it. It is staying silent about your hurt because you don't know how to say that you sometimes want to die when so many who look like you don't get to live. It is knowing when you say Black Lives Matter, you sometimes don't include yourself in that number. It is knowing that either way your days are numbered, but sometimes you are the one who is counting the loudest. When I was 22, I went back home to Kenya, and I swear I could not breathe the air. Everywhere I went, the stench of sadness followed. I convinced myself that people could smell it seeping from my skin. It took me a long time to realize that the smell was not my own, that it filled my grandmother's farm and the streets of Nairobi long before I got there, that would remain long after I left. I remember one day I realized that my kinfolk, we are a dying forest, that so many of us grew up to be lumberjacks. Each day, sadness sharpening our blades while our silence rushes to clot the wounds that we never speak of. That trip, I learned to be African, an immigrant, and depressed is to see your sadness as an import. Just another thing that has colonized your mind and body. A swinging axe you've been convinced has missed your family tree even though its handle is made from its bark. It is having others see poverty, violence, addiction, and disease as defining your culture. It is never speaking on these things, no matter how true they do not define your culture. It is a shame you feel knowing your grandmother survived a war with less tears than you cried this month. It is knowing that every day you are losing the civil war of the self, and that today may be the day your soldiers stop fighting. All right. Okay, I'll do this piece and then I'll end on what I like to call a lighter note, but whatever. This piece I actually wrote a really long time ago, and it came back into relevance. To be clear, it never went out of relevance. It's a piece about rape culture in the United States. But it came back, the conversation came back really, really heavily. First with this boy from Stanford, prestigious university, who'd raped this person and then was given like 3 months of probation because the judge was like, he has his whole life ahead of him. Okay. And then also the whole Harvey Weinstein, Me Too things that came out. I haven't edited it. I don't really have a desire to edit it, so it might sound a little different than some of these other pieces. And apparently I don't even have it in my thing, so we'll see how this goes. It's called the I'm Sorry poem, and it was around a time in my life where I realized I was really just being made to apologize for a lot of the violence that had actually been done to me and upon me. And that's part of the way that this violence continues, is that it makes those of us who have been experienced it hold it, really, the blame, the responsibility, the everything, when it was never actually ours to hold. So. I'm sorry. No, truly I am. I'm sorry for so many things, to so many people, through so many times, but most of all, I'm sorry I believed all the lies. I guess it should come as no surprise that the right to my body is just a social disguise, based on the notion that a man has a right to anything in his eyes, from my thighs to my hair, and no, not my locks, but the ones down there, as long as my skirt was short enough to invite him to stare. So, I'm sorry. I apologize for this disguise that I put on, but I'm so glad you knew it was meant to turn you on, because the clothes that I wear have no significance to me as a human being. Rather, they're meant for you to define me by what you're seeing. Believing my hemline determines my inner being, I invite you to look down upon me while I suffocate beneath this glass ceiling, so forgive me. Forgive me, please, for not getting the memo, that if I drink a little bit too much, I go from being a woman to a hoe. For forgetting that if I sip drinks, then liquor shouldn't be the only thing I expect down my throat, because if I'm not really asking for it, then he really won't. Now, I'm not sure if this apology is coming off entirely too sincerely. So let me take a minute to break it down for y'all a bit more clearly. This apology is a symptom of a social disease, seen from football rosters in Ohio to buses in New Delhi, with outbreaks of slut-shaming and victim-blaming mentalities, and no cure in sight under this current system of patriarchy. We've got invisible wars leaving visible scars on members of our nation's military. And don't get me started on what the hell is going on politically. See, I'd write my local politician, but he's probably taken the lead on defining rape in terms of words such as legitimacy. In fact, the following is a list of exact quotations taken from politicians in the United States of America. Rape victims should make the most of a bad situation. Rick Santorum, former presidential hopeful. Some girls rape easy. Roger Rivard, former Wisconsin congressman. Rape is like bad weather. If it's inevitable, you should relax and enjoy it. Clayton Williams, former contender for Texas governor. See, this disease has reached the top of our nation's leadership to the point of being endemic. But even without a medical degree, I've got a 4-step regimen that is sure to end it. Number 1, remember, rape is not about sex. It's about power and privilege. And if you don't believe me, take a detour into our nation's prison systems. Number 2, don't teach women self-defense, modest dress, or other ways to avoid being raped initially. Instead, let's foster a culture that teaches people not to rape indiscriminately. Number 3, the case makes it to court. I've got advice for those on the bench. Perceptions of character do not count as evidence. And finally, number 4, if a person is raped, look for the rapist and not the reason. That one shouldn't have to rhyme. All right. So I want to just end. First of all, thank you all so much. Can you give it up for yourselves? You've been a wonderful audience. So I've been here like snotting and talking shit at the same time. It's a skill. I'll do this piece, and then I'll end with you all a very short poem that was last year's attempt at writing a funny poem. But this one, back to this conversation of whiteness across borders. Man, I was in South Africa recently for this beautiful gathering of young Africans called the Breaking Down Borders African Youth Summit, because all the borders that are on our lands are colonial borders. So even to come to you and identify myself as a Kenyan is some real colonial shit, because they looked at this mountain that the Kikuyu called Kirinyaga, and they were like, huh? They're like, Kirinyaga. They're like, Kenya? Like, Kirinyaga. All right, it's Mount Kenya. Matter of fact, this whole country is Kenya. Welcome to Kenyan history. So South Africa, if you all don't know, has a very, very recent colonial history. 1994, I'm pretty sure all of us were alive then, is when they got independence or got decolonized, which is just not the same thing. And back to that conversation around like the tension that is felt that Bob was saying, South Africa is a place where if you step foot in that, you can feel it. It feels to me more like the United States than any African country that I've ever been to, because that racial tension is so thick there. So 2 years ago was my first time in South Africa. And I was just in the hotel lobby, and I was so excited because I was in South Africa, like amongst my people. Like there was Africans from I think 15 different countries all together, everyone speaking their languages, and I'm just like in awe, and I'm bringing my suitcase and accidentally just, when you bump something with someone's stuff with your things, and I turned just to be like, oh, I'm so sorry. And before I can even get that out of my mouth, this old white woman whose family clearly colonized South Africa was like, what are you doing? You need to go around. This land is occupied. I was like, first of all, even that language, right, of like this land is occupied in a hotel lobby, like it was a lot. But it also illustrates like the mentality of whiteness too. And I wrote this piece off of it because I think I was just so startled to experience that same interaction that I've honestly gotten used to in the United States in a way that is very unhealthy in South Africa, in an African country, in a country that was supposed to belong to me and my folk, So, my first night in South Africa. After crossing waters where my kin still stand, unable to find eternal rest on ocean beds. I find myself floating in a sea of black faces from every current that licks the coast of this continent. I am lost at sea. I am emerging in every face that my eyes behold between blinks. I hear myself in every turn of the tongue, regardless of the language that confines it. I have floated so far away from the shores of reality when my suitcase, it grazes lightly like a full gazelle against another woman's bag. I return from the paradise my mind has vacationed my sense of space to. I begin to pluck an apology like sweet fruit from beneath my tongue. When this white woman in South Africa raises her voice to me like I am a child whose careless hands have come too close to spilling the rainbow stew that sits in this nation's melting pot. This woman, she says to me, go around, entitlement filling the deep valleys that disbelief has created on her face, and in that moment, I am sure she has packed all of the white man's burdens in her suitcases. She speaks, And her every word becomes shovel to unearth the ghost of apartheid, and now we are toe-to-toe in this haunted hallway as she continues. You need to go around. This land is occupied. She says this, and she traces her finger through the air as if the act of drawing borders is her inheritance. It is not lost on me that I am here for a summit to break down borders, and this relic, she reminds me how many borders exist beyond the maps they've drawn on our lands. How to them, our very beings are borders that are able to be crossed with no consequence. This woman, she is the prodigal daughter of colonization, returned to her father's gluttonous feast on our land. I wonder if her ancestors told her to speak down to me the way mine told me to stand up to her, this woman. She says this land is occupied, as if I did not already know this. As if I too do not come from a country where whites have taken and taken to the point that they, and even we, believe it is theirs to hold in their hands. Their soft hands that have never worked the land, only overseen our bent or broken bodies. So I open my mouth, and decades of displacement fill the hotel lobby. The bellboy's mouth, it falls agape at my audacity. My spirit, it shatters at his silence. This woman, she tells me this land is occupied, and my brother's eyes beg me to wear quiet like a coat in this South African winter. I consider his request in my mind, but my body refuses. It remembers and it refuses to go back down a silence colonization once forced down my grandmother's throat, the same one that sits too comfortably in too many of my cousins' stomachs. But from the corner of my eye, I see my South African sister shift. I realize that her body remembers too. I watch her mouth transform from a body part to a blessing and tell this woman so simply, "Shut up. Who are you? Let's go, Mwende. This is not worth our time." We disengage from that which is only ever meant to take and take because her body, it remembers, it belongs here. It was birthed here. It was not beckoned by false burdens and jealous gods whose only path to kingdom is conquer. My sister reclaims this occupied land and she makes a way for both of us to pass. Later, she whispers to me how maybe sons and daughters should be made to pay the price that their fathers put on our fathers' heads. That maybe then they would understand that this land was never theirs to begin with. I respond with a throat full of thanks. I tell her how I almost took the woman's bags and threw them across the lobby, how I imagined her clothes taking flight, a scene of paradise in my mind. We picture it in our mouths. They burst open like ripe fruit knocked down in the winds of change because we are a lineage of survival and laughter. The recognition that they are sometimes the same. That sometimes our joy is our being, and our being, it is a reminder that we are still here, and being here is an act of resistance. Enough of a reminder that though the project of colonization is ongoing, it is an ongoing failure. Let our every breath be a reminder that we are still here, we are still here, we have always been here, and we will always be here. Thank you all again so much for the invitation to come here. I honestly don't think I would have ever come to this part of the world if I hadn't been invited, and I'm really, really glad that I did. So thank you guys for the invitation. I had planned to bring a bunch of books to share with y'all, and then I left all of them on the desk. But my lovely friend brought 10 of them with them. And there's 10 finalists in the final? Yes? So if possible, I would like to gift you all those books. Thank you for your work. Your guys' work was amazing last night. I was really glad too that I had actually quit Slam last year. And I randomly got selected to compete in the Women of the World thing, and I randomly won. And so people are like, "Oh, you're a slammer," and I'm like, "Oh, I'm retired." So I'm really grateful for this experience because you guys have actually made me really, really enjoy Slam in a way that I hadn't for a couple of years. So thank you for that deeply. Normally, I don't really give a shit about what note I leave on. I'm like, you got it, you all deal with it. But I do want to honor that you all don't like to leave all sad and depressed because it's cold outside and that shit's already depressing. So this is my first ever attempt at a humorous poem. In the US, when we do the individual slams, we have to do a 1-minute round, a 4-minute round, a 2-minute round, and a 3-minute round before you make it to finals where it's all 3-minute poems, which was hectic for me because if you can't tell, I just go on and on for a long time. I love it. I love telling stories. So like 1-minute poem, and I was like, oh shit, I've lost already. But I tried to do this piece. Have you all ever watched Disney princess movies? Yes. Ha, great. All right, so you'll know. Ha. It's very short, so I'm gonna run off the stage after, so, thank you all again. Growing up, my parents didn't let me watch bad movies. So for the most part, it was Disney princess cartoons. But the older I grew, the more I knew that Disney had shown me some things that were quite disturbing in reality, like how Beauty and the Beast is about a 17-year-old being sexually harassed until she's kidnapped and Stockholm syndromed into bestiality. Or like how Sleeping Beauty was supposed to make me believe that I should be excited if a man sneaks into my room to kiss me while I'm asleep, like that's what I should consider romantic or consenting or future husband material. And speaking of future husband material, let me tell you a secret the Little Mermaid whispered to me, that by the age of 16, I should be willing to give up my voice and my family for a man who would take another woman to the altar because she could sing. But the thing that really set me off was that lame attempt at racial retribution they call The Princess and the Frog. Because apparently a black girl can only pretend to be a princess and only for a half hour long. We have the gall to show these images to our daughters in their most formative stages of growth, without realizing that for 2 hours, we just let Mickey Mouse bitch slap them with the remote.